I'm always sick. I'm always out of milk. I can't do anything. You see all of this. What do you expect me to do? Fix it? I'm only 10. I can't even do anything this more. I just want to be a doctor or anything to help my people, my cat.
In the West, I don't think they really warmed up much to Palestinians because of the constant propaganda attempts run by the Israelis and by Zionist organizations worldwide to demonize Palestinians.
The Commission concluded that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinian.
We are told that the number of children that have had one or both legs and arms amputated is greater than in any other conflict this century.
The vast majority of the politically engaged Jewish Israeli public now is enthusiastically applauding the genocide and these large demonstrations they've had supporting the right to rape Palestinian prisoners.
America should punish the ICC and put Karim Khan back in his place. And if the ICC is allowed to threaten Israel's leaders, we know that America will be next.
The Trump administration has imposed sanctions on United Nations Special Rapporteur for Palestine, Francesca Albanese.
People elsewhere in the world have a long history of seeing the US acting as a rogue state under United Nations rules. But the question is what the rest of the world can do about this. And it was very disappointing, honestly, to me to see so many governments on November 17th voting for Resolution 2803.
احنا مستمتعين بهذه الشغله حابين انه احنا انا المعلمه ياسمين صبيح عمري 31 عام من غزه.
A Palestinian teacher has been awarded a $1 million educational prize for developing a method to promote dialogue for children who've been exposed to violence.
Hanana Haroub is a Bethlehem native, and she's been awarded the Global Teacher of the Year prize for her special teaching method in the West Bank.
I hung out with Hamas women legislators. You know, people in the kind of the soggy left in the West have no idea that Hamas actually supports women's education, women's participation in public life, women in politics, women in the professions, and so in our book, we were able to represent some of that and to counter some of that propaganda.
What I witnessed in Gaza, I can only describe as a dystopian, post-apocalyptic wasteland.
The only image that keeps leaping to my mind, it's a mousetrap.
We, the United States, are complicit. We are involved, hand in hand, in the atrocities and the genocide that is currently undergoing in Gaza.
The sacrifice, the unbearable sacrifice of the people of Gaza will help to bring this around and help to weaken the support that Western governments have given thus far to the genocidal settler colonial project in Palestine. But until we see the end of that genocide, we're going to be living in this state of real anguish.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. My guest today is a distinguished journalist, Helena Cobban. Her work focuses on global affairs, in particular the Middle East, and she's respected for combining on-the-ground reporting with deep scholarly analysis. She's also the author of multiple influential books on Middle East politics and global conflict, such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, The Making of Modern Lebanon, and Understanding Hamas, and several others. So needless to say, I think she loves conflicts. She's also the president of Just World Educational, which is a non-profit focused on education and global justice. She's recently talked to Professor John Mearsheimer, Richard Falk, and Vijay Prashad, and those are must-see conversations, and you can find those conversations on her YouTube channel, Just World Educational. And okay, I can keep going. It doesn't really end because I think you've done so much work. If I keep talking about it, I will still be reading this for the next half an hour. What I'll do is I'll better cut this short before I start feeling depressed at how much work you've done and how little I've done. So enough about that. She's joining me from Istanbul today. So thank you for being here, Helena. Great to talk to you. How have you been?
Good to talk to you, Ali. You've done some really interesting interviews. How have I been? I'm actually trying to write something about Gaza right now. And will Gaza be the requiem for the Western-dominated world order? So it's actually a huge topic and pretty depressing, but at the same time, maybe a little bit hopeful because I think it really will be the death knell of the Western hegemonic world order. So there we are.
I guess the situation isn't really getting better for Palestinians. It's getting worse day by day. And there's no end, actually. I mean, the end game is basically them either being killed or being pushed out. So I'm not sure how long it's going to take for that to happen. But
no,
yeah.
that's the end game that the Israelis and Americans aim for. It's not what they're going to get, because they've been aiming for that for 25 months now and have not achieved it. I mean, in that tiny sliver of land. So, it ain't over.
They've been trying to do that, but you have to commend Palestinian people's resistance and endurance in spite of all the sufferings and previous occupation, oppression, all the mass murders, killings, genocide, whatever label you want to put at it. They're still willing to go back to whatever's left of Palestine, I guess. And the recent floods haven't helped the situation also. There's scarcity of food. Obviously, there's no medical aid available to them as well. So not sure how they are surviving or how they will survive in future. But yeah, let's see what happens. I'm not that hopeful because of what I've seen for the last 2 or 3 decades. So the situation keeps getting bad and bad and bad. And the problem is, this isn't just one genocide. This genocide happening in Sudan, which is obviously, I mean, in my opinion, that's much worse than what's happening in Gaza. There's genocide happening in Sri Lanka as well, or happened in Sri Lanka. The genocide is happening in many parts of the world. But Palestine is a sad story of, especially when you look at it in parallel with Russian occupation or Russian attack on Ukraine, and how people defended Ukraine and how they failed to defend Palestinians. So that was a stark contrast that I felt, especially coming from the media, or corporate media. So yeah, let's see what happens. I want to talk to you about your book, but before that, I mean, I want to know more about your career journey and how you got involved in all this. You were born and bred in Britain, so comfortable life, good education, weather maybe not that good. But what made you wake up one day and said, okay, you know what, there's a lot of peace in my life. I want chaos, so I'm going to go to Middle East and cover conflicts. How did that happen?
Well, that wasn't exactly how it happened. I did have a, stable and privileged childhood, although my mother died when I was 8, which was probably a formative thing. And then I went to Oxford and studied math originally, and then ended up doing philosophy and economics, which was more helpful than math, although maybe I would be earning tons of money now if I were a mathematician. Who knows? So before I went to Oxford, my sister was living in Beirut because her husband was teaching at the American Community School, high school in Beirut. And I took a month-long visit to her there, and it was really exciting and intriguing for me. 1970, and there were armed Palestinians in part of the city with roadblocks. The Israelis had previously targeted the Beirut International Airport. There were huge numbers of Palestinian refugee camps in and around Beirut, and there was a good Palestinian information office there that I think I swung by it and took some of their propaganda stuff and took it home. But then when I went to Oxford, one of the societies that I joined there was the Oxford Union Arab Society, and I worked with them. It was, it was an intriguing time because you were having like Black September in Jordan, things that maybe people today don't remember. But then after I graduated, I decided it's a kind of a white privilege type of thing, that I want to go somewhere in the third world and become a foreign correspondent, which, sort of lots and lots of people have done that, like Evelyn Waugh or Winston Churchill, or lots of luminaries in the world of British writing. Actually, not so many women, if any at all, but I didn't let that stop me. So I went to Beirut. I used to call that region the Middle East, but it's actually a very Eurocentric toponym, because it's only east if you're in Europe. If you're, in outer space, just looking down at the Earth, clearly that portion of the Earth is West Asia. So nowadays I call it West Asia, and I try to remember to do that. But like so many institutions have the name Middle East or Near East, that it's kind of hard to remember to call it West Asia. But I think it's also helpful to do that because it gives you a more continent-centric, like Asian continent-centric view of that portion of the world. And you also start to see the Mediterranean as a kind of a fairly small body of water over there on the west coast of Asia, rather than being the center of the world, you know, which is the way that Europeans think of it. So it's a helpful kind of like mental exercise to just do some renaming. Yeah, so I got to Beirut in July of 1974, and then 9 months later, the civil war broke out. Which was fantastic for my career, you know. So it's not that I'm addicted to conflicts or that I seek them. I'm fascinated by them. I lived through that one. I lived from, well, it started in April of 1975, I forget the date, 13th, 15th, something, of 1975. And I stayed until, I want to say, April of 1981, by which time I had 2 small children, and it became totally clear to me that being a war correspondent was not compatible with being the mother of 2 small children. All the war correspondents that I knew at the time, I mean, I had some amazing colleagues and friends in the Western press corps there in Beirut, people who'd done sterling work in the Vietnam War, and then when that ramped down, they came over to Beirut, and they were wonderful people. But these, I mean, the men among them, and they were nearly all men, would have a wife at home to look after the children. Probably, you know, the wife would be in Greece or Cyprus or somewhere apart from Beirut. Me, I was both like the correspondent and the person who took primary responsibility for the children. There were a couple of other fabulous women war journalists there who were both French women photographers, Catherine Leroy and Françoise Desmoulder, and both of them had come from Vietnam, and they did amazing work in Beirut, but they were both single women, no children. So yeah, that's how it went. And then I had to leave Beirut. I'd been traveling all over the region prior to that, working for the London Sunday Times and the Christian Science Monitor. So I went to Cairo at the time of, or just before the killing of Sadat, I want to say. I covered a lot in Syria and Jordan, Iraq, the Gulf. I went to Iran once. It was, you know, an amazing life. But all the time, like I had my children in the late 70s, and so I also felt responsible for them.
Sorry, I was on mute. So did you have any terrifying moments in those days? What kept you, basically what I want to, I know, because I mean, what I'm interested to know is that despite all that, you kept yourself on the ground. Is that right? I'm sure there must have been very many terrifying moments, especially when you're reporting from war zones. So, I mean, any moment that sticks out to you that, oh gosh, I was lucky to survive that?
I guess 2 stick out. One is I was driving across the Green Line in Beirut, which was the line that divided Beirut between the Falangist militias and the Palestinian fighters and their allies who were in West Beirut. Now, my husband at that time was actually a Christian Lebanese, and he had family on both sides of the line, which in retrospect, I think was a gift for me, because I like it's too easy if you're living on one side of a dividing line in a war to just demonize the people on the other side. But, you know, I would travel across for professional reasons to do interviews and such in East Beirut. I lived in West Beirut. But I also traveled to see, you know, my husband's relatives, and just, you know, like they are his cousins, whatever, you know, and the fact that they live in apartment buildings in streets in which, like, all the posters in the street and the street art said, "It is the duty of every Lebanese to kill a Palestinian." Open genocidal propaganda. I mean, they lived in those streets, and I don't think they objected to the genocidal propaganda, but, you know, they were people. So that was kind of a good thing, I guess. But one time I was crossing the line with my colleague who was the bureau chief of Reuters, and I had a little Fiat 127 that I had bought off a friend in Beirut. And I was driving, and I came, what was the story? Oh, there were reports that the peacekeepers, this is so weird, there were Sudanese peacekeepers in Beirut at the time under an Arab League kind of ceasefire monitoring force. And there were reports that they had been sniping at some of the people going through the one crossing point. And so my colleague Andrew and I decided to test this proposition, and we drove fairly close to the crossing point, which was at the museum, the National Museum. And suddenly, so I was driving, and suddenly shots rang out, which was the evidence kind of that we needed to know what was, there was sniping, yeah. But I completely froze. I could not drive the car at that point. And for me as a woman, it was extremely humiliating to have this like crisis of my nerves. So I kind of got out of the car. Andrew said, I'll take over. And I kind of got out of the car and huddled around the front of it. And he huddled around the front and got in, and he drove us away. So that was like, okay, it was a moment of professional failure on my behalf. Another time, there in East Beirut, the Phalangists had just conquered the al-Zaatar refugee camp, which was a central point of Palestinian existence and organizing and resistance in that portion of East Beirut. So the chief Phalangist military commander was this young man called Bashir Gemayel, whom I would go and interview. And, you know, I'd be very professional when I went to interview him. He had a sort of endearingly childish side to him. He would kind of test out his English on us and ask, is this how you say this? But I knew how brutal he was. And actually, my good friend John Randall wrote an amazing book that later I republished for him, the whole book, called The Tragedy of Lebanon, about this whole era. But so on this day in August of 1976, when the Phalangists had maintained a really brutal siege around the al-Zaatar camp, and this was the day that it fell to them. And Bashir Gemayel called a press conference for the representatives of the Western media. And he said, and this is all in my Sunday Times reporting, I am proud of what you're going to see in al-Zaatar, which was chilling because I knew that we would see, you know, the evidence of atrocities, and we did. So his people drove us into the camp. And as we drove in, I can still remember what shoes I was wearing. As we drove in, you could see kind of little bumps. It was like muddy and dusty. on the track leading up into the camp, and you could see little humps and bumps that initially I thought they were like big bags of belongings that the people had left behind as they fled the camp. The Palestinians had fled the camp, and then it was clear that they were actually the bodies of people who had been shot while they were trying to flee the camp. Women, children, old people, and the cars were driving right over them. You know, it was the only way to go in. That was pretty shocking. And then we got out of the cars, and then Bashir Gemayel and his people led us further into the camp, and there were still shots ringing out, but everywhere there were bodies of, you know, people, civilians, non-combatants, no fighters. The fighters, some of the fighters got out the night before and managed to escape through the hills. Many of them were captured and butchered in, you know, mass killing fields by the phalangists. But these were the little old ladies and the mothers. And there was one place where I think one of the Palestinian groups had a clinic, and evidently some old people had huddled in the clinic and been told to come out by the phalangists. And so there were like 3 or 4 little old Palestinian ladies just dead in this little courtyard in front of it. I mean, I didn't feel, although there were still shots ringing out, I didn't feel like personally threatened. It was really a life-changing experience for me to see this, to experience it, to smell it, to put my feet in it, and to have had it all prefaced by Bashir Gemayel saying, "I am proud of what you're going to see there." Because this is clearly, like, as we've seen with the Israelis in Gaza, the Israelis who were very close allies of Bashir Gemayel, his backers, that you use the display of your atrocities as itself a means of terrorizing people. Unlike, for example, I mean, the Nazis built large walls around their concentration camps. They had, if you like, some sense of shame about what they were doing, or else they put the concentration camps, way over in Poland, you know, so that the upright German people didn't have to, like, think about this. And of course, you may have seen the movie Zone of Interest, which is about, you know, German family living in the shadow of an extermination camp. So actually, Bashir Gemayel, in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the Israelis put a lot of pressure on the Lebanese parliament, which elected him president of the country. And then he was assassinated. And in the aftermath of his assassination, his militiamen were brought by the Israelis to the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, which were in West Beirut. Now, when I first went to Lebanon to work in 1974-75, I actually taught a little class of girls English on a Saturday in Shatila refugee camp. I was never able to find out what happened to them after the massacres there, the massacres of September of 1982, when Ariel Sharon, the Israeli defense minister, brought Bashir Gemayel's militiamen to enact just horrendous revenge and terror on the people of Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, who were completely undefended at that point. So later, I mean, it's all actually really interesting because in Israel at that time, in 1982, when some of the reports and the reporting from inside Sabra and Shatila refugee camps came out, the Israeli public, the Jewish Israeli public, was absolutely, I mean, like hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million of them came out on the street to protest these massacres. And they brought down the government, and they forced Sharon, who was the defense minister, to go to a commission of inquiry. The Jewish Israeli public now is very different. It's really important to understand the degree to which those 43 years have transformed the Jewish Israeli public from one that was horrified at the news of Israeli enabled and Israeli atrocities to one that now is, enthusiastically. I mean, there are a few, there are a tiny number of voices in Israel that are protesting the genocide, but the vast majority of the politically engaged Jewish Israeli public now is enthusiastically applauding the genocide. And, these large demonstrations they've had supporting the right to rape Palestinian prisoners. I mean, it's such an enormous change over 43 years. Anyway, so I guess your question was about, was I in danger? I was in danger lots of times, but, many of the experiences that I had were really important and interesting ones, not only in Beirut either, I mean, also in other countries.
So in all those years, have you seen the opinion of corporate media or Western media changing for the good or for the bad? Obviously, we've got this recent genocide, but there have been massacres before, especially if you see October, before September 7th October 2023, the year 2023 was the worst year for Palestinian children, according to United Nations report. So there were massacres even before that, this October war. Have you seen the Western opinion change throughout all those years from Ariel Sharon to where we are right now?
So I guess Western opinion, I would say, is a little bit different from Western corporate media. But back then in 1982, in terms of the American corporate media, Tom Friedman and Lauren Jenkins both won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on the Sabra and Shatila massacres. So kind of the institution of U.S. journalism, I'm not saying it was pro-Palestinian, but it was anti-atrocity, let's say, in a much clearer way than it has been during the current genocide. And I think, the intervening events, you'd have to say, is like the whole post 9/11 war on terror, and then the systematic demonization of Hamas, which has continued, unabated since the 1990s. So back in, the 1980s, the PLO was still widely demonized. And it's hard now to remember that. But after I left Beirut with my 2 small children, and both my career and that first marriage were both in tatters, it was a kind of complicated period of my life. But I had a fellowship at Harvard University to go and write my first book, which was the study of the PLO. So I was basically using the notebooks that I'd been doing a lot of interviewing of PLO leaders in Beirut in the time that I was working as a journalist there. And, my friends at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, said, you should pull everything together and write a book, because nobody really has ever written a book in English on the PLO. And they helped to get funding through Harvard for me to go there and write my book on the PLO, which, I was writing that in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1982, while the Israelis were bombing the shit out of, my friends, my community, my ex-husband, even though I had like disagreements with him. You don't want the guy to be sitting there under Israeli bombardment. It was really traumatizing to see that happening. And I was sitting there trying to write my book, which I did. I kind of sublimated all my feelings of rage and anger into the writing. This was leading somewhere, and I've forgotten where it's leading. But anyway, but the PLO was so widely demonized at that time. And when I brought the book out, it was published by Cambridge University Press in 1984. And, I got all these reviews saying that I was just a PLO sympathizer and whatever. I was just trying to, understand the organization as a political scientist would, or as a journalist would, what were its origins, what were the motivations, how did they link up, how did they build their networks? And actually, it's a fascinating story because the leaders of the PLO, well, first of all, the PLO is a sort of an umbrella organization, and the core body within it then and now is Fatah. So Fatah was founded by Yasser Arafat and a clutch of his colleagues, all of whom were displaced Palestinian refugees in Gaza at the time. So it's really important. Gaza has always been the crucible of Palestinian nationalism because it is the place within the historic Palestinian homeland that has the greatest concentration of refugees from 1948 Palestine/Israel. There are something like 80%, some people say 85% of the current residents of Gaza were refugees originally from 1948 Israel. Whereas in the West Bank, there are also refugee camps that were established in the late 1940s. But the refugees in the West Bank constitute a far smaller percentage of the total population in the West Bank. So in Gaza, you have a concentration in two senses. You have large numbers of refugees, and it's a very small space. So they're like the UNRWA schools and medical facilities, and prior to October 7th, you could travel up and down Gaza in about an hour, and so they, back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that's where you had Yasser Arafat and Jihad al-Wazir and Salah Khalaf and a bunch of others forming this new, it's a sort of non-ideological, purely nationalism-based organization called Fatah. Most of them later went to get jobs in the Gulf. Now, the thing about the population of Gaza is that it's incredibly well educated. If you're a Palestinian refugee, really, education is your key to a future. And then a lot of these people would go to the Gulf, where Palestinians so well educated historically, and especially after the Nakba of 1948, they essentially founded the state apparatuses in all those little states up and down the Gulf. So, nowadays you have all this like Trump or others saying, well, we have to prepare the Palestinians to be able to be qualified to establish a state and blah, blah, blah. They established states in Qatar, in Kuwait, in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain. all of those state apparatuses were built by Palestinians and some Egyptians. So this neo-colonial rhetoric that Palestinians are not ready to administer a state is absolute nonsense. So that's what they did. Yasser Arafat went to Kuwait. I forget where Salah Khalaf went. Khalid al-Hassan, who was really sort of the godfather of this whole group, he ended up as the chief executive of the municipality of Kuwait. Mahmoud Abbas, who is now the so-called PA president in Ramallah, he set up the customs administration in Qatar. I mean, so they had these really fascinating lines of connection between the Palestinian diaspora and the Palestinians in the homeland, but Gaza was always the crucible, and it still is.
I think this thing about Palestinians being educated is very true. I think the literacy rate is around 97%, and 50% of them have higher education, college degree or something like that, which is really remarkable given the conditions they have been put in for the last, I would say, 70 years or more than 70 years, I guess. So, so basically, my question was, have you seen opinions from whether the Western media or Western people change towards Palestinians? So what I got out of this was maybe the people have warmed up to Palestinians' conditions or sufferings, but the media hasn't. Is that a right statement?
I don't think for most people in the West, I don't think they really warmed up much to Palestinians because of the constant propaganda attempts run by the Israelis and by Zionist organizations worldwide to demonize Palestinians. And, as I mentioned, I think that really accelerated after 9/11, when anybody, who was a Muslim or of brown skin or whatever was demonized as a terrorist. And that, that even happened to my own, the two children from my first marriage living in the States. It was a harsh time after September of 2001 to have an Arab name, which both of them do. But then remember that there was this election in the West Bank and Gaza in 2006 that Hamas won. First of all, it's important to note that at that time, the Bush administration and the Israelis both agreed to allow Hamas to take part in this election. Their thinking, I think, was that, it would be a way of including Hamas in the Oslo process, which was the basis for this whole election, but in a subordinate way, so that Mahmoud Abbas would be on top, and Hamas would be included and controlled underneath him. So they actually negotiated the terms under which Hamas would run in the 2006 election. Hamas had a sort of a front organization called the Change and Reform Party, and they ran a really good and very disciplined election campaign, which was certified by the Jimmy Carter Center and the EU monitoring, and this, there was no foul play or whatever, and they won the election, and that terrified the Bush administration and the Israelis, and then they provoked this attempt to overthrow the election in 2007, and Hamas was able to withstand that, but you ended up with a division of the West Bank was under the PA and Mahmoud Abbas, and Gaza was under Hamas. And after that, the Israelis, with full US support, threw a very tight siege around Gaza in 2007. And that siege has debilitated the people of Gaza ever since. And they punctuated that with launching a series of Israeli military assaults to which they gave the really spine-chilling name of mowing the lawn. You know, we're going to mow the lawn. I mean, it's so dehumanizing. I don't even like to say the words. But, you know, those military assaults, the first big one was at the end of 2008. There was another one in 2012, 2014, like every couple of years, the Israeli military would go in and just slaughter a number of people as a way of controlling the population. So all of that was going on before October 7th. And each time, you know, they made a big deal about Hamas, as they say it in Hebrew, Hamas terrorists, you know, do this, or Hamas this or that. And so the demonization of Hamas was very systematic and largely successful. Then, of course, with October 7th, you had this huge propaganda campaign that the Israelis immediately launched about, like, the Hamas terrorists burned 40 babies and, you know, committed mass rapes of, you know, innocent Israeli young women who were at the music festival. There was never a shred of evidence for any of this. And in fact, later in the Israeli media, a lot of evidence emerged that many of the people from the music festival who had been killed had actually been killed by the Israeli military themselves under what's known as the Hannibal Doctrine. But the propaganda was extremely successful to the extent that I know we shouldn't hold up Joe Biden as a kind of an example of mental acuity, perhaps. But, you know, he after October 7th, he said, I've seen the pictures of the 40 burned babies. I have no idea what he saw. He has no idea what he saw. Was it something, you know, concocted by the Israeli propaganda machine? None. There has never been any publicly presented evidence of these worst atrocities. I'm not saying that atrocities were not committed on October 7th of 2023. Almost certainly there were atrocities committed by both sides. The Israelis committed them under the Hannibal Doctrine against many Israeli civilians. And I think that many atrocities may have been committed by Palestinians who flooded out of Gaza after the walls were breached. You have to understand, these people had been in their concentration camp in Gaza by that point for, oh gosh, let me do the math, 16 years, from 2007 until 2023. And so once Hamas had breached the walls of the concentration camp, people flooded out. And I think they knew by and large. And so these included members of militias and fighting formations that were not Hamas, but also just, you know, general, like, as they say, some people say the riffraff of Gaza, you know. They came out and they knew that the goal was to seize hostages, because that's what, you know, Hamas had set as the goal, and some of those just regular Gaza families did manage to take hostages, and some of them looted, but the Hamas fighters themselves, their main target was to take Israeli military personnel as hostages into Gaza to exchange for their own thousands of prisoners, and they were stunningly successful. I've written a couple of times that they were catastrophically successful in doing, because they succeeded not just, you know, in killing or capturing large numbers of senior Israeli military personnel from around Gaza, but also the entire Israeli military command structure collapsed on that day. Not just the one around Gaza, but the whole of the southern command of the Israeli military. For the Israelis, it was obviously deeply, deeply shocking. And they've been working overtime ever since to try to reestablish what they call the credibility of their deterrence at the regional level. It has involved undertaking really cruel and aggressive military operations in Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and against Iran and Yemen, and even a little one against Tunisia. This whole Western concept of deterrence is something that we also need to look at, but because it's essentially a policy of cowing your opponents and potential opponents through sheer terror, as started in Hiroshima by the Americans in 1945. So, it has a long history.
Yeah, that's true. And that falls under, the principle or ideology of preemptive strikes. But so we see videos, images coming out of Palestine, Israelis killing Palestinian civilians, not just the images or videos from the Palestinians, but from the IDF soldiers who are very gleefully sharing it with everybody online. Obviously, that gets to, let's say, in Australia, in UK, and USA. In your opinion, do people now in 2025 contextualize what Palestinians did in October 2023? Or do they still say, okay, that was a terrorist act and Israel is sort of right in doing what it's doing? Have you seen any change from, let's say, from when you first started reporting in 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s? Have you seen any change at all?
Yeah, certainly. So when you say people, I think you're talking mainly about people in the kind of the Western Anglosphere.
Yeah,
people...
but not intellectuals. General public. Intellectual would go deep into the issue, but general public, normal people, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. As opposed to intellectuals who are definitely abnormal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also worth specifying the geographic zone in which you're looking at people, because I think most people in the global South have an instinctive understanding of the cruelty of Western origin settler colonialism. If people in India or in sub-Saharan Africa, they have the stories from their grandparents about how the British or the French or the Portuguese treated them. So those people, who constitute, by the way, 85% of humanity. Chinese, remember the century of humiliation that it was imposed by the British opium traders in the 1860s. Those memories are baked into the cultural memory of generations of people in the global South. It's people in the global North, if you like. You're there in Australia, definitely part of the global North, whatever it looks like on the globe. Western origin settler colonial societies in general have been thoroughly, for a long time, sort of propagandized about the advantages and the superiority of Western civilization, of Western culture, of Western practices. And if perhaps, sometimes some violations were committed, it was an aberration, and the British or the French immediately corrected it, and that's kind of the way it's looked at. But now with the Israelis live streaming very gleefully their own atrocities, I think it has spoken to a lot of people, regular people, normal people, in what you could call the global north, or, the West, more generally. And I mean, I've seen numerous examples of this. In the United States, there's this wonderful woman, I don't know if you've seen her social media feeds, Miss Rachel. She's just an early childhood educator who produces these gorgeous little videos. And she's been deeply moved by the suffering of the children in Gaza, and she has some of these children who've come to the United States for medical evacuation on her show, and she talks to them as if they were normal people, rather than like little devils from Gaza. And in one of her videos, she very movingly remembers how when she was young, there's this also iconic sort of TV-based educator in the United States called Mr. Rogers, and how at the time when there was a lot of institutional racism and demands that Black people not be allowed to swim in the same swimming pools as white people, Mr. Rogers had a Black friend on his TV show, and it was a hot day, so they put their feet into the same bowl of water, and then they shared a towel as they dried their feet. And Miss Rachel said, this was just for her as a child really, really moving. And she is doing the same with children from Gaza. Such a lot of a change at such a lot of different levels, including in the heart of, well, I'll put it in 2 or 3 different categories, but in the heart of Donald Trump's MAGA base, there are people who you would think of as being like white supremacists, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a member of the House of Representatives, or Tucker Carlson, or a lot of these people who I would not have expected to respond or, really have anything positive to say about these, about the Palestinians in Gaza. And they are definitely questioning the huge support that the United States gives to Israel, and doing so not just, or not even mainly, on the basis of empathy with the Palestinian people, but of deep concern about the costs, the monetary costs of the aid that the US is giving to Israel, billions and billions of dollars, that obviously should be used. It's our American tax dollars. It should be used for the well-being of people in their MAGA heartland. So that has been interesting. Another interesting development is within what you could broadly call the kind of the squishy left in this country, where there had been some very effective anti-Hamas propaganda about, Hamas oppresses women, Hamas is so opposed to gay people, Hamas are religious fundamentalists, Hamas and ISIS are basically, just 2 sides of the same coin. And when we wrote our book, or did our whole project on understanding Hamas and why that matters, that was one of the our main kind of target audiences that we had in mind, because this idea that Hamas is just like ISIS is very widespread, was very widespread. And I know from the reporting that I've done in Gaza, I did a good reporting trip there in 2006, right after those elections. I went back in 2009 twice, and I went back in 2011. But in all of those reporting trips, I interviewed a lot of people from all levels of the Hamas apparatus in Gaza. And I visited Hamas-run kindergartens. I hung out with Hamas women legislators. You know, people in the kind of the soggy left in the West have no idea that Hamas actually supports women's education, women's participation in public life, women in politics, women in the professions, you know, and so in our book, we were able to represent some of that and to counter some of that propaganda. And I think not just our book, but in general, I mean, our book, I think, has contributed something to the demonization of Hamas in American public life. And I'm really glad that it has. Another change has been in the American Jewish community, which historically, okay, there are different sections of the American Jewish community, and it's important to remember that there are large numbers of Orthodox Jewish people in the United States, some of whom are strongly and historically anti-Zionist for Jewish religious reasons. These are the people that you see in the very traditional Jewish headdress and whatever at many of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and they are numerous. Oh my Lord, are they numerous? You know, you sometimes see videos of their meetings in stadiums, you know, and you've got like 20,000 young Jewish men. There, it's only the men. But, you know, speaking out against the Israeli atrocities in Gaza. But there's also in the secular Jewish society, which by and large has been kind of pro the Democratic Party, pro Hillary Clinton, pro Barack Obama, and deeply, deeply Zionized, you know, and they would be upholding the idea of like Israel as a model nation, you know, a very moral nation, the most moral army in the world and whatever. The younger generations in this demographic they just really do not buy that propaganda anymore. I'm actually, I published two books by leaders in the organization known as Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a wonderful, increasingly effective organizing movement amongst this kind of often fairly secular, but now also identifying spiritually as Jewish. Actually, my daughter-in-law is on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm really proud of her. So, you know, things are definitely changing. They're not changing anywhere near fast enough because you've got all these like changes in opinion at the grassroots level, and then you have to work that through the political level and get it to affect policy. And that is very slow. It's happening, but it's happening far too slowly.
Yeah. Just before I move on, you mentioned Palestinian women. I think you talk about Jamila Shanti, the lady. You talk about her in your book. How was your interaction with her?
Oh, I loved her so much. You know, she was kind of my kind of woman professional. She kind of bustled into her office. I can't remember. I guess I interviewed her in the office in her ministry. She was social affairs minister at the time. Maybe she had been elected to the parliament. And she kind of bustled in, you know, with all her black robes flying around her and a big briefcase, you know, kind of falling open, and she pulled out her papers and you know, she was just a really effective woman. And at one point, a few years later, I can't even remember which year it was, she led a really powerful nonviolent action when the Israeli military were threatening the home of one of the Hamas elected leaders. in, I think, Gaza City. And so she and a bunch of other women went and camped out on the roof of this building as a way to provide protection for him. So yeah, that was really interesting to interact with her. Then I went to these Hamas-run kindergartens, maybe 2 of them, and that really surprised me a lot, because I had all these kind of, you know, Western Orientalist misconceptions about like Islamic education involves like a lot of rote learning, and you sit there and you have to just kind of learn the Quran and answer questions and get the answers right, and you know that, and then that's what it is. These were beautiful kindergartens, you know, with little gardens, and the teachers would lead little sort of physical education sessions in the garden, and then there were the classrooms were just like the best kind of classroom you can imagine, with you know, little books and a lot of beautiful colored things on the walls, and here's how you learn your numbers, and here's a game to help you learn the alphabet, and like, you know, just really excellent pedagogy. So I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have been so negative about Islamic education before then, but if that's what they want, if that's how they want to raise their children, and you know, with a lot of questioning, it was really impressive.
Yeah, but sadly, most of the schools and educational institutions, along with medical institutions, hospitals, are all gone now. So I saw a video of a lady trying to teach Palestinian kids, may not be more than 7-8 years old, those kids, in ruins, I guess, you know, there's no building. So you know, what can you do? So they were writing on whatever was left of the wall with rocks. So yeah, still heartwarming, but yeah, goes to show the resilience of Palestinian people, I guess. Which is why I asked you that question. Do people now empathize more with Palestinian suffering now that they've seen it, not only from the Palestinian side, what they have suffered, but also from the Israeli side, how they make Palestinians suffer? So that was the reason of me asking that question earlier. So your book, Understanding Hamas, is a compilation of conversation that you and your co-workers or co-authors have had with people, I guess. But what compelled you to put it in writing?
Okay, first, just before we go to the book, I want to go back to some of the work I did as a publisher, because I was running a publishing company I created in 2010, and I was running it until recently. Just a few months ago, I donated the whole thing to a publishing entity that is far better, like, prepared to steward this intellectual property than I was. But so I published, as I mentioned earlier, 2 works by leaders of Jewish Voice for Peace. I also published this book, The General Son, by Miko Peled, who is the heir of a very important Zionist family. I think his 2 grandfathers were both signers of the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. His father was a major and very important chief of staff in the Israeli military. Miko himself is a very dedicated anti-Zionist Jewish Israeli, and I was really proud to publish his book, which is still out there in a number of different translations. I also published 3 or 4 books by Gaza Palestinians, including my friend Leila El-Haddad. She's the co-author with Maggie Schmidt of a book that maybe it's the one that I'm proudest of having published. It's called The Gaza Kitchen Cookbook. And if you read it, which I hope you do, it is this, like, first of all, you've never seen a cookbook that has as many pictures of actual people doing their cooking and enjoying their food with their families. Normally in a cookbook, you just see the food, or you see somebody's hands as they roll, this or that, or they chop this or that. But we wanted to use this book to really bring the reader into the kitchens of Palestinians in Gaza. And it's an amazing record, and one that is heartbreaking because, of course, this entire food system has been destroyed. So I know Leila is traveling a lot these days, working with different groups, with the idea that you can use this book and the work they did in producing it to document a very rich and distinctive food tradition of Gaza, and then hopefully to use it as a building block for reconstituting the food system that has been so badly destroyed. And also I published the book by my friend Refaat al-Arir, who was killed by the Israelis on December 6th of 2023. What's the date today? It's very close to the second anniversary of his assassination.
5th December, yeah.
So, Refaat, I mean, what can I say about my work with Refaat? I had met him when I was in Gaza in, I want to say either 2009 or 2011. And then when I wanted to do a book that he would edit of testimonies from Gaza, from the people who had survived. This was in 2012, 2013, I was working on this project. So I wanted testimonies of people who had survived the big 2008 Israeli assault on Gaza. But Refaat, who was a teacher of English language and literature at the Islamic University of Gaza, was insistent that he wanted to edit with me a volume of short stories by young writers from Gaza. And he persuaded me. He said, stories are really important for us as Palestinians, and they will live forever, whereas a testimony of this or that, and now we know how many testimonies there are, but the stories live on and are universal. So the book came out in 2014, and I worked with a Quaker organization called the American Friends Service Committee to bring Refaat and two of the contributors of stories to his book. So the book contains 23 stories. 3 of them are stories that he himself wrote. It includes the preface that he himself wrote, very moving document, and it contains one of his lovely poems. So we brought Refaat and 2 of his story contributors to the United States. We toured them all around. Well, when I say all around, it's a large country, but we took them to, I think, 8 or 10 metropolitan areas on the East Coast, West Coast, in Chicago, in Atlanta, Georgia. And I mean, it was so moving to be able to do this, because Refaat was just this sweet, charming, empathetic, funny, very fluent English language speaker. He shortly thereafter went and did his doctorate in Malaysia in the poetry of John Donne. I mean, he was such a fine intellectual and a teacher and a mentor for his students, as well as being a great writer. So we took these 3 people all around the United States to audiences that had never knowingly at that point met a Palestinian from Gaza. I mean, maybe they'd met them a lot. They were delivering their Amazon deliveries. Maybe they were, serving in a restaurant. But, usually people would hide the fact that you're a Palestinian from Gaza, given the demonization of the entire society. So here we had these 3 really sweet people in churches and classrooms and community groups, speaking with people about the book. And it was so moving for everybody who got to meet them. And it was moving as well for Refaat, I know, and his colleagues from Ghazi, because as Refaat said, I don't know if he said it there or he wrote it maybe someplace else, he had never met at that point a Jewish person who was not standing over him with a gun and in a uniform. But they were sitting in Elise's front room having tea and cakes. They were discussing all kinds of things. So I think, that was such a moving thing to do, to bring Refaat. And of course, after he was killed, he was targeted. And killed because of his ability to connect with broad global Anglophone audiences. I have to say, since he was killed, we managed to sell, I want to say maybe between 12 and 15 foreign language translation rights to his book, Gaza Writes Back. And my friend Yusuf El-Jamal, who was one of those other two people on the speaking tour, Yusuf then worked with another publisher to bring out a compilation of Refaat's own writings under the title If I Must Die. If I Must Die was a poem that Refaat published on social media back in 2011. And it goes something like, if I must die, then you must live, something to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and 2 strings, and to make a kite that will fly over Gaza. Everybody who's watching this should know the poem, and if they don't, just go and Google If I Must Die by Refaat al-Ahrir. It's such a moving poem. And if I were in a better state of mind, I could recite the whole thing to you, but I've been traveling too much. So the attack on Refaat was part of this dedicated, what's now called scholasticide by the Israelis, which was the destruction of all of Gaza's 12 universities. They targeted the president of his university, the Islamic University of Gaza, for assassination. They also destroyed physically and enthusiastically and, on video, destroyed the buildings of all 12 of the universities. So, it wasn't just a little thing. It was part of this plan. Anyway, Refaat's legacy lives on, and people around the world know his name and honor his name and recite his poem, and so we succeeded in not only saving but also spreading his legacy.
I think that's great. There are a lot of people who still deny any wrongdoing by Israel. I mean, recently I read that Wikipedia's co-founder, Jimmy Wales, denies genocide and says we need to be neutral and remain neutral. Obviously, there are governments who deny genocide, but it's a different story when people keep denying any wrongdoing. And so, as a journalist, I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, you've been reporting from that region for quite some time now, and you've seen most of the conflicts happening. How do you feel when influential people deny all the wrongdoings? I mean,
so, there has been this whole industry for decades now in the West, and Ilan Pappé, who is this amazing Jewish Israeli scholar who's currently in England, has written very well about Hasbara, the propaganda that the Israelis and the Zionists have deployed since the very beginning, as a way of undergirding their claims to the land of Palestine and undermining any claims that the indigenous people might have. I mean, this is something that settler colonial regimes do everywhere. I mean, I'm sure it has happened in Australia, which was described by all the European nations for a long time as terra nullius, meaning, the land of nobody. So, and which enabled them to wipe out large swathes of the Aboriginal population. So Jimmy Wales, I don't know, the tech industry in the United States in general, is he American? I don't even know. But the tech industry in the United States used to be more kind of pro-freedom, and now it's become subverted into becoming very pro-oppression. And we can see this in US domestic politics, where, when Trump was inaugurated, he had this whole lineup of Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook and Elon Musk and Jensen Huang, and they all came to his inauguration and have all been vying for contracts to try to make money out of his domestic repression, including the outrageous steps that Trump is taking against immigrants in the United States. So, I'm not surprised, because these people have these huge financial interests in supporting Israel. And the way I look at, some people say, is the Israeli tail wagging the American dog? I don't see that there's a tail and a dog. I see one kind of heinous, blob of matter that is dedicated to the same end, and that end is to oppress low-income people and marginalized societies, both in the United States and in West Asia and wherever else they can make money. And the tech bros are a big part of this. Israeli tech developed this kind of great reputation for, we really know how to run surveillance systems, the kind of surveillance systems that they've been running in Gaza for years, but especially honed during the current genocide, where they had these tools called Lavender and Where's Daddy, and so Google and Amazon cloud services, they're all tied up with this, and they're all many of the leaders and founders and financiers of tech industries in Silicon Valley are people who are graduates of the Israeli military intelligence unit at 8200. So, it's one heinous machine there. Jimmy Wales, he's part of it. Wikipedia has been a great resource. It could very easily become completely distorted. Large portions of it already are. So just getting back to this question of genocide and whether people resist calling it a genocide and what is the importance of that, I think it's worth underlining at every possible on every possible opportunity, a couple of things. One is that the term genocide didn't exist until after the end of the Holocaust, when it was actually coined by a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust called Raphael Lemkin, who was a legal scholar in the United States. And he, to his credit, wanted to conceive of a legal concept that would include the Holocaust, but also be broader than it. And that was part of the concept of never again. you know? So under the Genocide Convention, which was adopted in 1948, states are under an obligation. States that are members of the Genocide Convention, which is 153 states, including yours and mine, they are under an obligation to prevent and end genocide whenever it occurs. So that is kind of that's why they want to deny using this term, because as soon as you use the term, then you're obligated to act. But so Raphael Lemkin, when he did that, I think it was a really wonderful initiative. And since then, we've seen for example, the genocide in Rwanda, which the United States for the longest time tried to deny that it was a genocide. They say, well, maybe genocidal acts have been committed, but not a genocide as such. And there isn't, ongoing genocide against the Rohingya in Burma. And now, obviously, this horrendous and fully publicized genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's important to understand that genocide did not start with the Holocaust, with the Nazi Holocaust. Genocide, in the way that we can understand it now, has been committed throughout history by colonial powers, particularly by those colonial powers that had what I call a hit and run capability that was given them by their naval prowess. And that is the West European origined colonial settler projects that started with the Portuguese in 1415, were continued by Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean in 1492, where there is clear evidence from Christopher Columbus onwards of genocides being committed by every single settler colonial project. So, what was distinctive, if you like, about the Holocaust in terms of comparative genocides is that it was carried out against basically European white people. Prior to that, it had been, there'd been the Ottoman genocide against the Armenians, who were problematically white, possibly white, anyway Christian, but nearly always prior to the Nazi Holocaust, the perpetrators had been West European colonial empires. And the victims were indigenous people who were wiped out across the whole of the continental United States, wiped out across most of Australia, wiped out in much of Southern Africa, and so on. This is a big historical trend that is very much associated with West European colonial empires.
That's true. Again, like you mentioned, genocide has happened even before that. Even from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, hundreds of millions of us were killed and left to rot on the streets. There was no need for gas chambers because they didn't need it. They would just have to take the food away from us, and then we would die. So that was before the Bengal famine. Japanese genocide of Chinese, 20 to 30 million.
Yeah.
Even before that, if you go back. But the term, when it was coined under the United Nations umbrella because it had happened against the Europeans. So that's how I feel as well.
Although strictly speaking, it wasn't under the UN umbrella. It was an independent treaty. So, I mean, I've been looking at some of this recently because the UN resolution of November 17th, Security Council Resolution 2803, by which the Security Council adopted the entirety of Trump's horrendous genocide plus ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza. I think that's going to pull the United Nations down. like into the gutter. But other important human rights instruments will remain if they are not part of the United Nations, including the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions and many of the other international human rights conventions. So I just like to make that point.
No, thanks for that. But United Nations hasn't been, what's the right word, influential for a long time now. I mean, you recently see, not recently, it happened probably a couple of months ago, Karim Ahmad Khan, the prosecutor of International Criminal Court, being sanctioned under Executive Order 14203 by United States. Francesca Albanese, sanctioned under the same Executive Order 14203. So once you see these organizations and the people from these organizations getting sanctioned by the most powerful country in the world, you sort of lose faith in the institutions anyway. So, which is why I said there's very little anybody can do. I mean, it's very difficult to go against United Nations and Israel in this world. So, not sure what's going to happen. But how do you feel as a journalist when you see these sanctions being levied against? So these are not reporters, but they are reporting on facts, or they are basing their analysis on facts. How do you view it as a reporter?
Well, you know, the United States government is a rogue government at this point, and has been for a very long time. Actually, the US-led military operation against Serbia in Kosovo in 1999 was completely unsanctioned by the United Nations. And the US-led attack against Gaddafi in Libya in 2011, again, completely unsanctioned by the United Nations. The only US military operation in recent times that was to actually, you know, part of a UN operation was the invasion of Afghanistan. And that was also quite complex. But the US-led aggression against Iraq in 2003, Kofi Annan himself said it was quite illegal. You know, so people elsewhere in the world have a long history of seeing the US acting as a rogue state under United Nations rules. The question is what the rest of the world can do about this. And it was very disappointing, honestly, to me to see so many governments on November 17th voting for Resolution 2803, including the government of Algeria, which you would expect, given Algeria's history of, you know, fighting against French colonialism, you would expect Algeria to be, you know, steadfast. And then because the Algerians and the three other majority Muslim states on the Security Council all voted for the resolution, I think that was a big reason why the Russians and the Chinese said we cannot, you know, put our hand up to block the resolution through veto, which I think otherwise they might well have done. And so the resolution was allowed to pass. How do I feel about the sanctions? You know, the UN has always been, in essence, a creature of US hegemony, although for a long time that hegemony was kind of diluted by the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union collapsed and you had US unilateral ability to dictate what the United Nations did, it's been a very rough time for people who believe in, you know, the Charter of the United Nations, which is quite a lovely document, except that it's just words on paper. at this point, I have to go back to the early years of the United Nations and re-examine the decision they took in November of 1947 to partition Palestine and to sanction the establishment there of a small settler colonial state run by the Zionists, who at that point constituted, Jews in Palestine, both the Zionist ones and the ones who had been there since before Zionism, constituted less than 1/3 of the country's population. They controlled a tiny sliver of the country's territory, and yet they were given, the United Nations gave them this completely new settler colonial state. When was it? 25 years later, when Ian Smith in Rhodesia tried to do the same thing and to prevent the emergence of an independent Zimbabwe, the United Nations rightly completely opposed that move. But in 1947, and that was just 4 months after India and Pakistan had been admitted to the United Nations after having thrown off English, British colonialism. So, you would have thought in 1947 that the trends of history, the winds of history were blowing in favor of, national liberation from European colonialism. But here comes the United Nations saying, oh, let's put a little Zionist colonial settler state into the heart of Palestine. I think that was a very serious original sin of the United Nations. And it was supported at the time both by the United States and by the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, I think, saw it as a way of weakening British control in the region. So, I think it's good to have some skepticism toward the record and the possibilities of the United Nations. I know right now a lot of people, my friends in Washington, D.C. and some around the world are hoping for something called a Uniting for Peace resolution, which would be something the General Assembly could adopt as a way of circumventing a U.S. veto at the United Nations, at the Security Council. So Gustavo Petro of Colombia and various other world leaders are looking for this idea of a General Assembly kind of workaround. But I think that would have been applicable if you'd had another US veto at the Security Council for a ceasefire resolution, instead of which we now have the Security Council having adopted the Trump plan. And I'm not sure, given that Algeria and Pakistan and Indonesia and all these important, Qatar, Turkey, all these important Muslim states have expressed support for Trump's plan, I don't see that a Uniting for Peace resolution is going to be politically doable or implementable. So the world is really in a bad state.
So the reason all these so-called Muslim countries voted for it, because obviously they are watchdogs. They don't have any sovereignty, especially the governments. Also, they get loans, IMF, World Bank. So that's a sort of neocolonial or / imperialism that keeps them in check. So, which is why I said there's very little hope of peace or a Palestinian state, I guess, because everybody is against a Palestinian state. If you think about it, let's take a position. Okay, there are so many Muslim countries, Gulf countries, who are very rich. People are very rich. GDP per capita is enormous. If they wanted, they could have helped Francesca Albanese or the ICC prosecutor by giving them jobs or stuff like that, or make sure they still have an income. None of them helped. All of them participated in the sanction. So there's very little willpower from all these Muslim countries to help Palestinians. I mean, you can see, the blockade that Egypt has done of Palestinians. So even though the Egyptian population supports helping Palestine and Palestinian people, the government doesn't, because they get a lot of funding from these institutions. And now the Syrian government is in bed with Israel and the United States. So you see all those Gulf countries surrounding Palestine, all these Muslim countries, they want a good relationship with Israel and United States because their end game is more wealth and more money and more freedom for themselves, for their own royal families, and for the people, I guess. And you can sort of see that when Israel attacked Iran, Qatar allowed the bombing of Iran. It allowed its own airspace to be used by Israel. Saudi Arabia allowed its own space to be used by Israel. So there's no, which is why I will always say there's no such thing as Muslim countries or Muslim Brotherhood. It's just a label people use when when they just want to get their way, I guess. So yeah, so even if there's a resolution that's going to come up next year, most countries will vote alongside United States. So it will be very difficult for Palestinian people, especially now, to get their own state. That's my feeling, I guess. But do you see, at any point in future, United States or UK government engaging with Palestinian people in good faith? Because of that terrorist label, it makes it really difficult for them to negotiate with Hamas or whoever is in control, because once you label someone terrorist, you can label the entire population, okay, they are part of Hamas or they are part of the terrorist organization. And when you see that happen, let's say in India, in 1919, I think anarchy law was passed because there was so much shortage of food in India, and Britishers were just taking food away from us. Most of our people died, and they were taking food away from us to their own, soldiers. And people started revolting. They started fighting with sticks and stones or whatever. Most of us got killed. Then they passed a law. Terrorism, or the word terrorist, hadn't been invented at that point, but they passed a law, 1919 law of anarchy. Whoever rebels against the British Empire will be put to death straight away. So, and they just killed swaths of villages, loads of people in a village. If they see that they're hoarding grains and they're not giving it to the British soldiers, they would come and take the grain away. People will die of famine, or people would get killed as well. So once you label someone terrorist or anarchist, it becomes very difficult for political governments or politicians to negotiate with them. How do you, let's say, how would you negotiate with Palestinian people or Hamas, given the label that they've been given?
First of all, I think it's really interesting to hear your views of Indian history, and it's really important. I hadn't heard of this thing called the anarchy law. But that's just like the antecedent to, like, let's get people really concerned and scared about terrorism, When I was growing up in England in the 1950s, there was the Kenyan independence movement called the Mau Mau uprising. And we were terrified, the Mau Mau are so bad and this and that. And and then suddenly you wake up one day and open the newspaper, and there's the Governor General of Kenya, hauling down the Union Jack. And there's, Jomo Kenyatta, who previously had been Mau Mau, and he's hauling up his flag. That's decolonization. Like, those labels are used until the moment that they're not. And Nelson Mandela, you know. I mean, there were the South Africans negotiating like behind closed doors in Pollsmoor prison with him. At the same time, they were labeling him publicly as a terrorist. So, you know, those labels can definitely like be disattached at a moment's notice. That's not a problem. So you talked a little earlier about, and I know we shouldn't go for too much longer, about the fact that all these so-called Muslim governments, you know, have deep financial concerns about, you know, they have to keep in good relations with the IMF and whatever. And of course, this year we've had the whole tariffs issue, which has terrified a lot of these governments around the world. I do think the world is changing in terms of the financial infrastructure of the world, and Chinese financial instruments are becoming much more widespread and more potent and more available. I forget who it was. It was probably my friend Vijay Prashad who pointed out that even though the Chinese were not prepared to like openly confront the Americans at this point over Ghazi, still the fact that they could offer financial support and financial instruments to Gustavo Petro of Colombia did a lot to strengthen his ability to stand up to the Americans. And I note also that you know, China has a huge number of different financial and economic and logistical ties with countries throughout the global south, including, you know, countries in the Arabian Peninsula, that it's no longer wholly US hegemony, that these countries have considerable ability to maneuver aside from US diktat, and that ability to maneuver is getting larger and larger. So it's going to take time, because the IMF, which is, you know, an instrument of US control, continues to be extremely powerful, but you have all kinds of instruments of Chinese and BRICS and Bridge and Road Initiative, financial ways of paying in renminbi rather than in dollars, of conducting transactions separate from the SWIFT system, and that is growing. So, you know, I wish it would grow faster, of course. So then you asked about, can the Palestinian people get their own state? That's a, you know, the Palestinian people have a deep problem that we have to recognize, which is that they can't reach clear internal agreement amongst themselves on whether they want to have a state alongside Israel, along the lines of Resolution 242, a two-state solution, or whether they want to have a single non-Zionist state in the whole of Palestine. And I know that's a problem, and it's kind of one version of it, one version of that divide exists at the level of the political relations between Hamas and its allies in the resistance movement on the one hand, and Fatah and the PLO on the other hand, which are now wholly underwritten and supported by the US-Israeli axis. So, I mean, Fatah and the PLO act, in effect, as concentration camp guards and enforcers for the Israelis in the West Bank. So it's really problematic. And I mean, I saw this, I did a good study of like South Africa's transformation into a formal democracy. And the time of transformation there was accompanied by really, really harsh internecine fighting between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Movement. I think something in excess of 10,000 South Africans were killed in that fighting, which of course was provoked and exacerbated by the white colonial authorities, just as the division between Fatah and Hamas is completely supported and provoked by the Israeli-American colonizers. So, that's a challenge for the Palestinians to be able to navigate that and to overcome those divisions. I'm confident that they can do it, but it's not easy. And Hamas, for their part, have said that they are quite prepared to go along with a Palestinian state alongside Israel, so long as that's what the majority of the Palestinian people want, which I think is a great position. Another issue, of course, is who you count as stakeholders in this matter. Everything that the Oslo process has done until now has been to allow the vote only to registered residents of the West Bank and Gaza. And guess who controls the registries? It's Israel. So all the Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinian people who have been expelled from the historic homeland, have not had a franchise, a vote in any of the elections that have been held. So that has to happen. You have to have a very broad process, and maybe the sacrifice, the unbearable sacrifice of the people of Gaza will help to bring this around and help to weaken the support that Western governments have given thus far to the settler colonial project, the genocidal settler colonial project in Palestine. But until we see the end of that genocide, we're going to be living in this state of I'm not going to say despair, because despair is like a luxury, but of real anguish.
Just on the China note, I did a video yesterday with the journalist Jason Smith. He's an American journalist who lives in China and hosts a radio show there. It was exactly on this Belt and Road Initiative. I actually read his book. And I was talking to him about the differences between China's assistance to developing countries, comparing it with IMF and World Bank assistance to developing countries. So I understand how China tries to develop poor countries, and in contrast, how IMF and World Bank have austerity measures when they give loans to these countries. But the question of Palestinian statehood, it's not going to happen because Israel doesn't want it to happen. I mean, it's as simple as that. And Israel has the power. They want greater Israel. People ask the question, does Israel has a right to exist? South Africa has a right to exist. It was an apartheid state. It became a one state. It didn't form into two states. So did Zimbabwe. So does Australia. Australia had a history of genocide against Aborigines. But Australia didn't become two states. It's just one state because there was desire by both parties to have a single state. Same in America as well. They killed a lot of natives, but then became one country. Israel doesn't really have any plans to divide the land. It wants to control the land. And I think that's something that you talk about in your book as well. I think Mowing Rabbani talks about it in his conversation. You mentioned that in your book, that there is very little desire on part of Israel to accept any solution at all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about, when I said, when I noted the extent to which Jewish Israeli society has lurched to the right over the last 43 years.
Right. Thanks very much, Helena. I know I've taken so much of your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I would love to do that again sometime when you've got some free time. I know you travel a lot. You were in Malaysia, now you're in Turkey. Just, I read somewhere that Professor Richard Falk got detained at the Canadian airport. That was probably 2-3 weeks ago. He's 95 years old and was considered a security and a terror threat. So just be careful, when you go to Canada or United States. So because you are a lot younger than him.
No, he's a dear friend, and it's outrageous what they did to him.
Right. Thank you very much,